The premise of this question is false, and correcting it is the most important thing anyone can understand about the history of slavery. White people were enslaved, enormous numbers of them for thousands of years across most of Europe and the Mediterranean. The English word slave comes from Slav, because Slavic peoples were captured and sold in such quantities during the medieval period that their name became the word for the condition. That etymology is not a curiosity. It is the whole answer in miniature. Slavery was close to universal in complex human societies. What was not universal, what was in fact historically unusual and geographically specific, was the idea that one group of people could be enslaved because of how they looked, permanently, heritably, and by law. That system was built in the Atlantic world over roughly 2 centuries, and it was built for reasons that had nothing to do with any characteristic of the people it targeted. Let's dig into this properly, because the sequence matters enormously and it runs the opposite way to what most people assume. Start with how widespread slavery was. Mesopotamian law codes regulate it. Ancient Egypt had it. Classical Greece was heavily dependent on it, and Athenian democracy operated alongside a large enslaved population. Rome enslaved people on a scale that shaped its entire economy, drawing captives from Gaul, Britain, Germania, Thrace, Greece, Syria, and North Africa, which is to say from populations that would today be sorted into several different racial categories, including large numbers of people who would now be called white. The same institution appears across Asia, in various forms in India and China, in Mesoamerica, in indigenous societies of North America, and across Africa. The specific forms differed enormously. Some societies enslaved captives temporarily. Some absorbed them into households and lineages over generations. Some worked them to death in mines. What they shared was the basic fact that some people were owned by others. Let's talk about the enslavement of Europeans specifically too, because it is the part that has largely dropped out of popular memory. Through the early medieval period, Slavic peoples from Eastern and Central Europe were captured in large numbers and sold south and east, moving through trading networks including Italian merchant cities into the Mediterranean and Islamic worlds. The trade was substantial and sustained. Later, corsairs operating from ports along the North African coast raided shipping and coastal settlements across the Mediterranean, and as far north as Iceland and Ireland, taking European captives. Estimates for the total number enslaved over several centuries run into the hundreds of thousands, and by some accounts well over 1 million. Coastal villages in Italy, Spain, and Greece were depopulated. There were religious orders in Europe whose specific purpose was raising money to ransom captives. The Ottoman Empire drew enslaved people from many regions, including a system that took boys from Christian communities in the Balkans for training in state and military service. Galley fleets across the Mediterranean, Christian and Muslim alike, were rowed substantially by enslaved men, and captured sailors on either side could expect that fate. Within Europe, unfree labor persisted in other forms. Serfdom bound millions of peasants to land they could not leave, with obligations that were heritable and enforced by law, and it was not abolished in Russia until 1861, after the American Civil War had begun. This detail is worth sitting with directly because it establishes the baseline. For most of recorded history, being enslaved was a matter of misfortune rather than ancestry. You were enslaved because you lost a war, because your village was raided, because you were sold for debt, or because you were born to someone already enslaved. Nobody thought it required an explanation rooted in what kind of person you were, because everyone knew it could happen to anyone. So the real question is, what changed? Let's talk about sugar too, because the Atlantic system begins with a crop. Sugarcane cultivation and processing is exceptionally brutal work. Cane must be cut by hand in intense heat, and once cut, it begins losing sugar within hours, so it has to be milled and boiled immediately. That means the mill runs continuously through harvest, with people working around dangerous machinery and open vats of boiling liquid on very little sleep. Injury and death rates were high. Europeans developed plantation sugar production first on Mediterranean and Atlantic islands, then expanded it into the Americas, where the Portuguese established it in Brazil, and others followed across the Caribbean. The economics were extraordinary. Sugar was enormously profitable, demand in Europe was effectively unlimited, and the constraint on production was labor. That constraint is where the entire system comes from. Plantation sugar required large numbers of workers doing lethal work, and no free population would do it voluntarily at any price the planters were willing to pay. Let's talk about who they tried first too, because the sequence disposes of any idea that Africans were selected for some particular quality. Colonizers first attempted to force indigenous American populations into this labor, and did so extensively in some regions. That approach collapsed for reasons that were catastrophic rather than economic. Old World diseases against which indigenous populations had no prior exposure caused mortality on a scale that is difficult to comprehend, in many regions killing the overwhelming majority of the population within decades of contact. Beyond that, indigenous people knew the land, had communities to escape to, and in some jurisdictions were subject to legal restrictions on their enslavement that, however weakly enforced, created complications. Europeans came next. Large numbers of poor Europeans crossed the Atlantic as indentured servants bound to work for a term of years in exchange for passage. Conditions were frequently severe, and mortality was high, particularly in the early tobacco colonies, and some were transported involuntarily as convicts or after military defeat. But indenture had features that made it unsuitable for planters. The term expired, after which the servant became a free person with a claim on land and a vote in colonial politics, creating a growing population of poor free men. Servants had some legal standing and could and did petition courts. They had families and communities in Europe, and crucially, an escaped European servant could disappear into a colonial population that looked like him. Meanwhile, the supply contracted as economic conditions in England improved and word of colonial conditions spread. Let's talk about why the trade turned to Africa too, because the reasons are specific, documented, and entirely unrelated to any supposed suitability for bondage. Several factors converged. Portuguese trading contact along the West African coast had been established for decades, and networks for purchasing captives already existed. Some African states and merchants participated in selling war captives and others into that trade, which is a fact that belongs in the record, and which does not diminish European responsibility for building the system that created the demand or for what was done to those people afterwards. Distance mattered enormously. A person taken thousands of miles across an ocean cannot walk home, has no community nearby to flee to, and frequently shares no language with others on the same plantation, which was sometimes deliberately arranged to impede communication and resistance. Visible difference mattered for the same reason. In a colony where the enslaved population was distinguishable by appearance from the free population, escape became far harder and enforcement far easier. This is a fact about surveillance and control, not about anything inherent in the people concerned. There is an epidemiological factor as well, and it should be stated precisely because it is frequently distorted. Populations from parts of West and Central Africa had higher rates of certain inherited traits and prior exposures, conferring some resistance to malaria and yellow fever, diseases that killed Europeans in tropical American environments at devastating rates. That difference is real, and it affected mortality patterns. It did not make anyone suited to enslavement, and mortality among enslaved people on plantations remained appalling, with sugar colonies in particular requiring continuous new imports because deaths exceeded births. Above all, Africans in these colonies had no legal standing whatsoever, and no state that would intervene on their behalf. That absence of protection, rather than any characteristic of the people, is what made the arrangement stable for those profiting from it. Let's talk about where the idea of race itself came from too, because it has a traceable history and it is much shorter than most people assume. Ancient societies certainly noticed physical differences between peoples and frequently held views about foreigners that were hostile or condescending. What they generally did not have was a system sorting humanity into a small number of biological categories arranged in a fixed hierarchy. Classical writers explained difference largely through climate and environment, holding that peoples were shaped by the places they lived and that a person moving elsewhere or adopting different customs could change accordingly. Roman citizenship was extended across the empire to people of every appearance. Medieval European distinctions ran primarily along religious lines: Christian and heathen, which was a status a person could change through conversion. The systematic biological version emerged in the 17th and 18th centuries, developing alongside the Atlantic plantation economy. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Naturalists began classifying human populations into fixed types with assigned characteristics, and those schemes carried evaluative rankings from the outset. The 19th century added apparatus, measurements of skulls, elaborate taxonomies, and eventually attempts to enlist evolutionary theory, producing a body of work that presented itself as science and functioned as justification. All of it collapsed under examination. Genetic research established that human variation is continuous rather than clustered into discrete groups, that the great majority of genetic variation occurs within populations rather than between them, and that the traditional racial categories do not correspond to biologically distinct groupings. The categories turn out to be social and historical constructions with real and serious consequences rather than descriptions of natural divisions. That finding matters for the question directly. Asking why one race was enslaved and another was not presumes the categories existed beforehand, and that the sorting followed from them. The historical record shows the opposite order. Let's talk about slavery within Africa too, because an honest account has to address it, and doing so carelessly produces distortion in either direction. Slavery existed in African societies before European contact, as it existed in societies across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. Forms varied enormously across the continent. In many cases, enslaved people were war captives absorbed into households and lineages, with children born into the community rather than into permanent inherited bondage, and with routes to incorporation over generations. Other arrangements were considerably harsher. There was also a substantial trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean trade in enslaved people, running for centuries and moving very large numbers north and east. Historians estimate totals over the full span comparable to or exceeding the Atlantic trade, though spread across a much longer period. When Europeans arrived seeking captives in quantity, they engaged with existing structures and transformed them. Demand on the scale the plantation economy required had not previously existed anywhere, and it altered the incentives of coastal states dramatically. Firearms flowed inland in exchange for people, warfare intensified in several regions, and some polities reorganized substantially around supplying the trade while others were devastated by it. Historians continue to debate the relative weight of African agency and European demand in driving this, and the serious versions of that debate do not treat either as absent. Two things follow, and both need saying. African participation in the trade is a documented historical fact rather than a modern invention. And it does not distribute responsibility evenly because the demand, the plantations, the ships, the profits, the hereditary legal framework, and the racial ideology were all European constructions, and because the system built in the Americas was categorically different in kind from what preceded it anywhere. Let's talk about how the law made it racial too, because this is where the ideology gets constructed, and the process is documented in statute. In the earliest decades of English colonial America, the status of Africans was ambiguous. Some worked terms and became free, acquired property, and in some cases held servants themselves. The boundary between indentured servitude and lifelong slavery was not yet fixed. It was fixed deliberately through legislation passed over subsequent decades. A Virginia statute of 1662 established that the status of a child followed that of the mother, which made slavery heritable through the female line, and meant that children born to enslaved women were enslaved regardless of paternity. A provision with obvious and horrific implications given the sexual violence endemic to the system. Further laws established that conversion to Christianity did not confer freedom. closing the earlier route by which religious difference rather than ancestry had defined status. Successive acts restricted manumission, criminalized assembly, restricted literacy, and progressively defined a legal category based on ancestry. Alongside the law came justification. The idea that African peoples were naturally suited to servitude, or intellectually inferior, or divinely ordained for the position, was elaborated in the 18th and 19th centuries into systematic pseudoscience, complete with skull measurements and taxonomies. Every part of it was constructed after the economic system it defended was already running, and every part of it has been comprehensively refuted. This is the crucial point, and it deserves stating plainly. Racial hierarchy was not the cause of Atlantic slavery. It was the product of it, a set of ideas developed to explain why a society professing liberty and Christian equality was holding millions of people in permanent hereditary bondage. Let's talk about resistance too, because accounts that describe only what was done to people leave out most of what those people actually did. Enslaved populations resisted continuously in every form available, and the historical record documents it extensively. At the largest scale, there were revolts. The Haitian Revolution, beginning in 1791 in the most profitable plantation colony in the world, resulted in the defeat of French forces and the establishment of an independent state governed by formerly enslaved people. The only case in history where a slave revolt produced a lasting nation. Its consequences reverberated across the Atlantic world, and France later extracted an enormous indemnity from Haiti in exchange for recognition, a debt that burdened the country for well over a century. Major uprisings occurred across the Caribbean and in Brazil, and revolts in North America, though smaller, were persistent enough that the fear of them shaped colonial legislation heavily. Escape was constant. Communities of people who had fled plantations established themselves in remote terrain across the Americas. In Brazilian interiors, Jamaican mountains, Surinamese forests, and Florida swamps. And some of these maintained independence for generations, negotiating treaties with colonial powers from positions of genuine strength. Everyday resistance was more common and harder to suppress. Work slowdowns, feigned incomprehension, tool breakage, deliberate inefficiency, and theft of the produce of one's own labor appear throughout plantation records, generally in the form of owners complaining about them. Cultural continuity was itself resistance. Languages, musical traditions, religious practices, foodways, and family structures were maintained and transmitted under conditions specifically designed to destroy them. Abolition, when it came, was driven substantially by that resistance alongside organized campaigning, in which formerly enslaved people who published accounts of their own experience were central. Britain abolished the trade in 1807 and slavery in most of its empire in 1833. Compensating slaveholders rather than the enslaved. The United States ended it through civil war. Brazil, the largest importer, abolished it in 1888. Let's talk about what the system did to people too, because a structural account can become abstract in a way that obscures the subject. The Middle Passage involved confinement below decks for weeks in conditions that produced mortality rates historians estimate at somewhere between 10 and 20% of those embarked, varying by period and route, from disease, dehydration, and violence. Ships' records themselves document this, since captains recorded losses as commercial data. On arrival, people were sold individually, which meant families formed on the voyage or in holding were broken at the point of sale, and families formed afterwards could be broken at any time by the sale of a spouse, parent, or child. The scale of that separation is documented in advertisements, in bills of sale, and after emancipation in the enormous volume of newspaper notices placed by people searching for relatives they had been taken from decades earlier. Those notices are among the most direct surviving evidence of what the system cost. Violence was structural rather than incidental. Legal codes explicitly authorized physical punishment and in many jurisdictions removed liability for killing an enslaved person during correction. Sexual violence against enslaved women was widespread, and the law making status follow the mother meant that children resulting from it became the property of the men responsible. Labor conditions varied by crop and region, and the sugar colonies were the worst. Populations there frequently failed to reproduce themselves meaning deaths exceeded births continuously and the system depended on constant new arrivals to maintain itself. That is a demographic statement, and what it describes is people being worked to death faster than children could be born. None of this is included for effect. It is included because any explanation of why the system existed is incomplete without a clear statement of what the thing being explained actually was. Let's talk about what made this system distinctive too, because not all slaveries were alike. Atlantic chattel slavery combined features that had rarely appeared together. It was permanent with no customary route to freedom. It was heritable across generations indefinitely. Enslaved people were legally property that could be sold, mortgaged, and inherited as objects, and status was assigned by ancestry and marked by appearance. The scale was immense. Historians working from shipping records estimate that around 12.5 million people were embarked on ships crossing the Atlantic, and that roughly 10.5 million survived the voyage. Those numbers represent individual people, families destroyed, and communities in Africa disrupted across centuries. Let's talk about the present too, because slavery is frequently discussed as though it ended in the 19th century, and it did not. Forced labor, debt bondage, forced marriage, and human trafficking persist worldwide. And international organizations estimate the number of people currently living in conditions meeting the definition of modern slavery in the tens of millions. Those estimates involve significant methodological difficulty and are contested in their details, and no serious source puts the figure at 0 or anywhere close to it. The demographics of contemporary forced labor do not track the racial pattern of the Atlantic system. Victims are found on every continent and come from many backgrounds, with vulnerability driven by poverty, migration status, conflict, gender, caste, and the absence of legal protection. That last factor is the constant. The mechanism identified earlier, that people without legal standing or a state willing to intervene are the ones who end up in bondage, operates now exactly as it did then. Mauritania is generally cited as the last country to formally abolish slavery, in 1981, with criminal penalties only introduced considerably later and enforcement remaining a documented problem. Forced labor in supply chains, in domestic work, in fishing fleets, and in construction is reported across wealthy and poor countries alike. The reason this belongs in the account is that it tests the explanation. If Atlantic slavery had been caused by race, contemporary slavery would follow racial lines. It does not. It follows powerlessness, which is what the historical evidence indicated was doing the work all along. Let's zoom out and pull all of these different threads together. The question assumes something that never was. Slavery was practiced almost everywhere, and Europeans were enslaved in vast numbers. By Romans, in medieval trade networks, by Mediterranean corsairs, and in forms of bondage that persisted in Europe into the 19th century. What made Atlantic slavery different was that it became racial, and it became racial because of a specific economic problem. Plantation agriculture demanded enormous quantities of lethal labor. Indigenous populations were devastated by disease and could escape into known terrain. European indentured servants had legal rights, expiring terms, and the ability to disappear. Into the free population, Africans could be obtained through existing trade networks, could not return home, could not escape unnoticed, and had no legal protection or state to appeal to. Only after that arrangement was established did anyone construct the elaborate racial ideology explaining why it was natural and proper. The laws that made slavery hereditary and race-based were passed decades into the colonial period, tightening a boundary that had earlier been blurred. Which leaves an interesting thought worth sitting with. People were not enslaved because they were considered a separate kind of human. They were classified as a separate kind of human because they had been enslaved, and the idea outlived the institution it was invented to defend.